So I'm very honored to have been invited to this and very glad to be here. I'm sorry. No, oh, sorry. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not getting this thing to. Oops. Couldn't get it to move. Oh, okay.
You kind of have to drag it.
Am I audible now in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is an idea that I've been. Where am I producing feedback? This is an idea I've been working on for a long time. I did have an opportunity to talk with Jerry about this some. I'll tell you what his reaction was when we get there. I'm sensing there's a lot of feedback. Is that, should I lower the microphone? Okay. Can I still be heard?
Yeah, mic.
Sorry?
The mic doesn't seem to be on anymore.
Oh, it is, but, okay. How about now?
Yes.
Better? Okay. Okay, so, in the language of thought, Jerry argued several things. One, that primitive concepts cannot be learned. Secondly, that all or almost all of our concepts are primitive, and thus that almost all of our concepts are innate. Many people found this to be outrageous, and the view acquired the nickname Mad Dog Nativism, a name that Jerry embraced. Well, in his book Concepts, Where Cognitive Science Went Wrong, and in LOT2, he modified his stand about nativism. He still maintained that no concepts were learned, but he allowed that some concepts might be acquired. So I think this modified version of nativism we can call grumpy cat nativism. So this is obviously an important distinction for Jerry between concept learning and concept acquisition. So what's the difference? Well, in general, learning is a particular kind of causal process. For those of us who think that thinking is computation, it's a causal computational process relating an experience to a mental state in such a way that there comes to be a rational relation between the experience and the content of the subsequent mental state. And furthermore, the transitions between intermediate states mirror rational relations. So examples of this are inductive generalization, logical inference, practical reasoning. Now, the term acquisition in this context is meant to be quite nonspecific. It covers any causal process that begins an experience and eventuates in a new mental content. In the case of concept acquisition, there's no requirement that there be any rational relation between the experience and subsequently added concept. Jerry gives some examples in LOT2. He says, for example, here are some ways you can acquire concepts: through surgical implantation, or by swallowing a pill, or by hitting one's head against a hard surface. We're going to talk more about that later. Okay. However, if you want to say that concepts can be acquired but not learned, you have to confront the doorknob problem. What's that? Well, since there are no constraints on something's being a process of concept acquisition, and in particular, no constraints on there being any match between experience and the concept that's acquired, we have this question: why should concepts be typically acquired on the basis of their instances? And Jerry proposed to answer this question by appeal to a process of concept acquisition that he describes and that he calls triggering. So let's talk more about triggering. Jerry says that stereotypes, and we're talking about empirical concepts that can be acquired through perceptual experience here, stereotypes are things that Jerry says can be learned inductively. So you can project hypotheses about what a group of experiences have in common, and then you can formulate a hypothesis about what they have in, what these features are, the most important features are, and then you can confirm those inductive generalizations by further experience. So the first step of triggering is a process that takes you from experience to the formation of a stereotype. So that process, Jerry calls P1. Now I have to say I have concerns about this first step, but I'm not going to pursue those concerns. I'm going to sort of pretend that we don't have the stereotype step in what follows. But in fact, what Jerry proposes in LOT2 is that once we have a stereotype, then we have a process that he calls locking. This is the process by which a mental representation or mental representation type gets locked on to a property in the external world. And when that happens, the mental symbol acquires the content of having that property. Now, P2, this second step, the locking step, Jerry says is, quote, some reliable but not intentional, and hence a fortiori, not inferential, neurological process. So P2 is not supposed to be psychological. Long quote from Jerry. He says P2 is, quote, no sort of inference at all. It's, as it were, a subintentional and subcomputational process. It's a kind of thing that our sort of brain tissue just does. You have to have Jerry's voice to say that. Something our brain tissue just does. Did I get it? Psychology gets you from the initial, still Jerry talking, psychology gets you from the initial state to P2, then neurology takes over and gets you the rest of the way to concept attainment. Intentional explanation can't, in any event, go all the way down on anybody's story. Sooner or later, neurology has to take over. And then he adds, sooner or later, physics has to take over. So he thinks that we're just at the point where there's nothing to be said in an intentional idiom about the process that takes us from the stereotype to that affects a locking between the property that the stereotype stereotypically represents to the actual concept that has that property as its content. So I think Jerry is assuming here what's a pretty standard taxonomy of causal processes. The first type is rational causal. You could also call it, that's my name for it, but we could also call it intentional causal processes, psychological causal processes. And the second is root causal. And this is a fairly common term for causal processes that can't sustain intentional interpretation. Okay. Concept acquisition includes a rational causal step, P1, and as I said, I have some concerns about how that can quite be given other commitments Jerry makes. But what I really want to focus on is the move from P1 to P2, which is supposed to be brute causal. I think that to say that the step from the stereotype to the locking, or the locking process itself, to say that that's brute causal, I think brings back the doorknob to doorknob problem. Why should stereotypes of doorknobs trigger the acquisition of doorknob? So here again we have the standard taxonomy, and I want to say some things now more substantively about these kinds of processes. Rational causal processes, I think, have two subkinds. I'm not going to talk about the difference between these subkinds, but I will say that I accused Michael Devitt in his book, Ignorance of Language, on not recognizing the existence of the second type. So the first type is that rules are among the premises, as it were, of the rational causal argument. The second is the rules are not explicitly represented, but they are embedded in some way in the operation of the mechanism. And I call call computational processes of either type 1 or type 2, call them strongly rational. And I'll say in a minute exactly what I mean by that. Brute causal processes are non-rational. There's no, they don't sustain intentional interpretation. So I think of rational causal processes as exhibiting something that I call strong mirroring. And here's going to be a bunch of language. So I'll read it once and then read it again. So what it is for rational causal processes to exhibit strong mirroring is to say that they involve a set of physical elements, representations, and physical states involving those elements, such that the elements at each stage of the process reflect, under intentional characterization, the premises or conclusions of a valid or cogent inference. So this is just the idea of a computational process is a syntactic machine that's driving a semantic machine. But also, importantly, it has to be that the properties of the physical elements to which the physical mechanism is sensitive, that those properties mirror the logical or semantic properties of the premises and the conclusion, in virtue of which the mirrored inference is sound or cogent. So the first requirement is that you have these elements that are involved in the different stages of the process that have physical characteristics, but that under intentional characterization, the stages of the inferential process reflect the premises, under intentional interpretation, reflect the premises and conclusions of a valid or a cogent argument, inference. The second thing says it has to do this in virtue of the mechanisms exploiting the physical properties of the representations that encode the logically or semantically important features of their contents. Brute causal processes, on the other hand, are characterized by there being no rational relation between inputs and outputs, even under intentional characterization. I should say there's no built-in rational relation between the inputs and the outputs. If you characterize them intentionally, you can just characterize, once the state of one of these seats being up is signifies yes, and it signifies no, and it's being down signifies yes, and it computes the function is something you can sit on, something like that. So you can assign contents to things, but it'll be a fortuitous or a sort of forced interpretation, not something that relates naturally to the structure of the things involved. The process, importantly, when you've got a brute causal process, is the process does not mirror any inferential process. Okay, so let's look at some examples. First example, I said we were going to talk about heads butting up against, getting concepts through heads being bumped up against hard objects. So here's a little boy bumping his head, and let's suppose that just because of the way the bump causes the brain to jiggle, I go into the details about brain jiggling, but it's too technical, so I'm just going to move on. So just for some fortuitous reason, the kid, the concept doorknob, pops into his head and gets locked onto the property of being a doorknob. In contrast, we have the case of having perceptual interactions with doorknobs triggering the acquisition of a concept doorknob. So we want to distinguish the head bump caused acquisition of doorknob from the doorknob caused acquisition of doorknob. And if they're both brute causal processes, we really need to know what about the second brute causal process makes it the kind of process that properly causes concept acquisition. So this is one constraint on an adequate solution, is that we have to be able to make this distinction, reconstruct the distinction. But it's not the only distinction we need to mark. Let's look at our little kid again. Suppose that the bump on the head through the same process of brain jiggling causes the kid to acquire the concept bump. Well, now it looks like he's acquiring in a brute causal way the concept bump on the basis of experiencing a bump. But that doesn't seem right. It shouldn't be that just a bump on the head causing bump to pop into his head is good enough. It's a different story if he perceives the bump and as a consequence of perceiving the bump, acquires the concept bump. That's the process I want to characterize. I want to say that there's a difference in the way bump is produced, and it's a difference that psychology needs to take account of. Now, when I tried to tell Jerry about this, he looked at me and he had, that sort of squinting frown that he had. He sort of shook his head and he said, "It's hopeless. It's hopeless." I found that very encouraging. So I went on to say that in order to distinguish the first from the second case, we need to say something about how the causal process eventuated in the formation of a belief, of a concept, and why one way is good and the other way is bad. What we want to avoid is what some other philosophers in an epistemological context have called mere exculpation. I think that was Donald Davidson's term. Does anybody know? I think it was Davidson. So what is mere exculpation? Well, people in epistemology who are internalists, who think that in order for you to know something, the evidence or the justification has to be inside your head. It can't just be a matter of a reliable process. Epistemological internalists hold that without there being some kind of rational connection between perceptual state and subsequent perceptual belief, they're epistemologists, so they're interested in belief, without such a connection, the citing of a perceptual encounter in response to why do you believe that is no better than exculpation. And here's my gloss. Here's what I think is meant when epistemologists talk about mere exculpation. What they're saying is, if you say that it's simply the fact that this perceptual encounter caused this belief, and the fact that it's a reliable covariation is all we can say, it sounds like what you're saying is that given natural law and the antecedent circumstances, the subject couldn't help but form the belief, any more than the window can help but break when hit in the right way by an errant baseball. So it's not like you understand why the window broke. You can really see why the window broke when the ball hits it. No, it's just that it's the case empirically that certain kinds of things hitting windows made of glass causes them to break. And similarly, it will just be the case that certain kinds of experiences cause you to have certain beliefs, or in the case of concept acquisition, cause you to acquire a certain concept, and that's all that can be said. So what I wanted to do that Jerry thought was hopeless was say how I could distinguish these different kinds of brute causal processes. So brute causal processes can provide, I say, nothing but exculpation. To get all the way to justification, I think what we want is for there to be something like what epistemologists also call, also talking about epistemologists, what we want is something that they call a basing relation between the experience that triggers a concept and the concept that it triggers. And my suggestion is that we just make a distinction among causal processes on the basis of which ones utilize the information that's contained in a perceptual encounter from those that don't utilize the information. And I want to call this form of causation intelligible causation. So now I want to tell you a little bit about how intelligible causation works. So first I want to introduce the notion of a Dretskian representation. I call these Dretskian representations because I'm appealing to an idea that Fred Dretsky developed in a very interesting way. Dretsky was interested in information-carrying signals as the sort of first step of the formation of intentional content. And this is, broadly speaking, of course, the kind of approach that Jerry wanted to take to naturalizing intentional content. So Fred pointed out that in perceptual encounters, the perceptual representation that's generated carries information in something like the strict information theoretic sense, that is, that the probability that the distal cause occurred, given that the signal occurred, is 1. Now, in the longer version of this, I make a lot about the idea that a perceptual representation it genuinely carries information in this very strong sense. So I argue in other places that perceptual representations can't be false. They don't, illusions are not a case of false representation, they're a case of something else. But in any case, if you'll just give me that in some sense, in the sense that Fred had in mind, we can say that a perceptual representation carries information about its distal cause. But perceptual representations don't just carry information, they encode it. So if you know the coding scheme, you can actually sort of transcribe discursively the information in a perceptual representation. Now suppose that perceptual processing is sensitive to the physical parameters that realize the encoding. What will we get then? Suppose further that the information that's encoded in a Dretskian vehicle, in a Dretskian representation, an information-bearing representation, suppose that it's such that if the information were to be specified discursively, if you can break the code and you can write out the information that is carried by the perceptual representation, suppose it would provide an evidential basis for the correct application of the concept that it triggers. So you get information about light intensities, and you look at it and you say, oh, yeah, sure, that's the sort of representation you would expect to see if there's a horse in front of you. I see. This is, yeah. Looked at this way, the perceptual representation is actually providing good evidence for the belief that there's a horse. So if you've got this sort of setup, then the relationship between the perceptual experience and the acquired concept would not be fortuitous. So when the kid bumps his head, and because of perceiving the bump, acquires the concept bump, the kid is actually, the process, the locking process, works because it is actually sensitive to and taking advantage of information that's carried in the perceptual representation. When the kid acquires the concept bump just on the basis of brain jiggling, that's just an accident. There's information in the bump, but it's not information that plays any role in the production of the concept. So let me give you an example that I think makes clear what I have in mind. This is something that if you know a 12-year-old who's handy would like to build me, I'd be very indebted. It's a tree ring counter. Every home needs one. What you do, so you've got this tree, and this is actually a section from a what's it called? No, it's not a yellow pine. It's a very ancient tree, something pine. No, bristlecone, thank you. This is a section of bristlecone pine, but no bristlecone pines were harmed in the production of this section. I actually paid more money than I would like to admit to get this. And what you can't see here are all the literally microscopic rings inside the rings that you can see. If you go out to one of the national parks in California, you can see one of these things under a microscope, and it's just astonishing. So these are thousands of years old. Okay, how does the tree ring counter work? Well, in my mind, you've got this little device that's on a wheel, and the device is exquisitely sensitive to thermal gradients. So some of the rings are darker, some of the rings are lighter, so the darker ones are going to be slightly warmer than the lighter ones. Now what happens when you roll this tree ring counter over the rings is that every time it crosses a gradient, there's a register that clicks up 1. So if you go from the outside of the tree section to the center, at the end, you'll have a number that is the number of years that the tree was alive. So it didn't do a classical computation. It didn't represent a premise about the ring, what the rings indicated. They indicate cyclical changes in rainfall during a year, and thus that every time you have a ring, you've got a year. It didn't represent any of that in the way that a rational causal computation would. But since we know the code, we know what's going on, we know how the information can tell us the age of the tree, what we've done is build a device that's responsive to that form of encoding, and at the end gives us something, a number of years the tree was alive, that's rationally related to the evidence that would be uncovered if we transcribe the significance of each tree ring change. Now there are some other examples, template matching, like this is the way it would be nice if concepts worked. And Jerry agrees with me that would be nice if this is the way concepts work, that you get a perceptual experience and you've got all these stencils in your head. And the little person in your head takes the stencils and one by one tries them out to see if they fit the perceptual experience. And when they do, they say, okay, horse, right? The problem is, where did the stencils come from? So that's the argument against that, but it would be very nice if that's the way concept acquisition worked. I think that this model of an intelligible causal process can also tell us something about pattern recognition by neural networks, right? We know what the coding is, the input vector, and we know how we're interpreting the output vector, but we know that there's nothing going on in the network that could be mapped onto a rational inference from the evidence in the input vector to the content in the output vector. So I want to extend the taxonomy then. So we've got the rational causal processes and the brute causal processes, and what I want to add is intelligible causal processes. That's what I want to call these processes. So now let me give you, so I want to say that the rational causal processes are strongly rational, and that's because they exhibit strong mirroring. The brute causal processes are non-rational because they don't exhibit any mirroring at all. And I want to say that the characteristic of the intelligible causal processes that's important is that they are weakly rational. So let me now give you the general characterization. You've seen an example or two. Let me say in a general way what it is for a process to exhibit weak mirroring. A process exhibits weak mirroring if, first of all, it involves an input-output relation that is best or most usefully characterized in intentional terms. And I mean for this to be a completely pragmatic notion when I say best or most useful. It's the information is there. How it's characterized is up to us. Because in an important sense, although the intelligible causal process is going to use the information, it's not representing the information as it uses it. So the input-output relation is profitably characterized intentionally, even though the intermediate causal stages do not mirror the steps of a rational inference in the way that's required for strong mirroring. So, to put it a slightly different way, weak mirroring obtains if the inputs to the process, construed under an appropriate interpretation, bear some kind of rational relation to the outputs similarly construed. In that way, the process that we're looking at sustains intentional interpretation as information processing. Even though it's subcomputational, the steps are going to be, we can't characterize them as stages of transformations of one intentional representation to another, but we can still make sense of the idea that it's information processing. And the relation between the inputs and the outputs, the inputs to the process and the output of the process is non-accidental and intelligible. We can understand what's going on. provided that the input and output are characterized intentionally. So intelligible causation isn't psychological, I'm conceding that, because the process mediating the informational state and the acquired concept does not mirror the inference that we, the theorists, use to characterize the evidential relationship, but it's not brute causal either. Now, special bonus. Intelligible causation could be the way that you can get from states with non-conceptual content to states with conceptual content. So one of the things that Jerry was working on that had a big influence on me was a suggestion that perception involves non-conceptual representation. That creates what I think of as an interface problem. Because if you've got a non-conceptual representation, for Jerry that means you've got a representation that doesn't have any syntax. But a rational causal process can't work on something that doesn't have syntax. So we have to get a theory of the interface. We have to know how a non-conceptual representation eventuates in a conceptual representation in a way that has some kind of justificatory character. So I think intelligible causation can do it. So, thank you, audience, and thank you, Jerry. Let's see, EJ?
You said, what exactly do you mean by rational relation? Sort of truth preserving or anything like that?
A relation that preserves the rationally important properties. So if it's an apodictic inference, it has to be truth preserving. I don't know how to characterize, say, inductive generalization in those terms, but the idea is that there's a rational connection between those premises and that conclusion.
So just a quick follow-up. So one place where I think that there is need for this sort of halfway point between fully rational and brutally causal is in characterizing genuine piece of cognitive penetration.
Cognitive penetration?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what it would be.
If there were.
Yeah, what it would be for.
Oh, okay, yes, yes.
Cognitive penetration, and so I wondered if you thought at all about applying it to that. Because there, similarly, we have, we want to distinguish between thinking about the exam tomorrow, making me see spots. That doesn't seem like cognitive penetration. But also, if a desire for an object makes it look larger,
yeah,
that's not a genuinely rational influence,
but there's a semantic.
Yeah, so I would just
yeah,
maybe you can apply this.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks. Yeah. So, how are you thinking of it? So you've got this is going, as it were, non-conceptual to conceptual. You're thinking this is going the other direction, conceptual to non-conceptual. Yes, and that's a question I always ask when I listen to a talk by a defender of cognitive penetration. So, I mean, it's one thing for me to have the category of the kind of causal process it would be. It's a whole other thing to actually say how it works. I'm sort of interested in all of these interface questions. So, in the case of action, we've got a nice causal story about how beliefs and desires can cause intentions to act. But then how does the intention to act make the right muscles move? How does the content of that intention actually make things work? And I'm nowhere on that, so I'd be happy if anybody knows. If there's an article that's 4 pages long that I can understand about it on the train, I'd really like to know that. Thanks. Yeah, Eric.
So I really like the way you're resisting his position. I'm wondering why you conceded the bit about templates.
Okay.
So you and Jerry agreed. It would be nice if there were these templates, but that's just not going to work. And of course, it's not going to work for a lot of those, just for the little limited domain where he has a chance. Well, why not just say that there are psychological mechanisms for creating these templates?
Right.
It's very plausible. And if that's the case, it's certainly not brute causal, right? It's not like, that particular concept pops into your head because something big.
Right.
It's just, you have these psychological systems that have the function to create a template in that context, right? So it's not at all accidental.
So that could be P1, right? How experience gets you to a stereotype. If you think of the stereotype as a template, That's kind of the view you have, isn't it?
Well, it depends on what kind of concept you're talking about.
Well, let's just talk about empirical concepts like of natural kinds, just to make it
I don't
easy.
think something that, you'll need more than a template for natural kinds. Just something like a perceptual concept.
Okay, yeah. No, so I mean, it would be fine if there were templates. As I said, I really like theories that I understand, and I understand how that would work. It's when you say, it's just like that, except without the template. That's what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, my misgivings about, I couldn't really figure out why Jerry was willing to say that the construction of the stereotype on the basis of experience was an inferential process, a psychological process, because surely you have to conceptualize the experience if you're going to make a rational inference to the stereotype. And where do you get that conceptualized content from? There still has to be an interface between something that's not conceptual and something that's conceptual. So that was sort of the concern that I had. But I'd be happy if there were templates. Well, there's some people who haven't spoken.
Thank you. Yeah, so I also really like the idea of thinking about like more intelligible and less intelligible forms of causation. But I was wondering whether that really gets you at what's special about concepts. Because I'm thinking, here's one way in which I could start creating concepts. Like I attach a new mental symbol to 3 kinds of perceptual experiences and introduce it. And suppose the right story about content predicts, then that gets latched on to, like informationally, to whatever those experiences were about. Then I'm going to have like this truth-preserving transition. Like whenever you're in this perceptual state, you go into another mental state which actually carries information about what's in the environment. But intuitively, it's like, that's like, I could have done this in any old way, so it was like not a useful concept. So were you thinking there's going to be other conditions about like which ways of like transitioning from perceptual states to like more cognitive states that are especially useful?
So I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind. Are you concerned that we'll have this proliferation of pretty stupid concepts that aren't good for anything? Or
Right.
are you worried
But
about...
I'm interested in the question of we're trying to do something when we introduce concepts, and I'm not. It can't just be coming up with a symbol that tracks something in the environment. There has to be like more specific characterization of what we're trying to do. And
So,
rational transition is just, if rational transition is something truth preserving, that's too permissive. Like,
Well, so
there's too
remember-
many things being rational.
so just to be clear the way I'm trying to set things up, so rational causal processes, it's not enough that there's a rational relation between the input and the output under intentional characterization. There are constraints on what the steps have to be like, and they have to involve steps that strongly mirror the stages in an inference. So you're not going to just get rational cause concepts willy-nilly. But now, when we introduce concepts, we want to do this. Is that a metaphor, or do you really think that concept acquisition is an intentional process?
I mean, I don't know what intentional means, but I do think there's, in a sense, something that concept acquisition aims at. Maybe that's like
Okay, so
functional thing. Maybe
right.
In some cases in science, you might think that we really are aiming for something, and it'd be interesting to characterize what we're aiming for.
So a big divide between Jerry and neo-Darwinians like Dennett is that Dennett wanted to say there's no distinction between real intentionality, really having an intention, really making a plan to do something, and the kind of purposiveness that nature displays in crafting just the right size hummingbird to go with the right size orchid in Madagascar, right? So there's an intention, there's a purposiveness, a teleology to the co-evolution of those two things that then says that's all that's going on in our heads too. Fodor argued, and I'm completely persuaded by this, that no, they're very different processes. When we intend to do something, we generate a representation of our goal, and that representation becomes causally relevant in the... So obviously that can't be the story about concept acquisition, because then you're back in the dilemma that was posed in line of thought 1. But if you want to say that the concepts aim at something, beliefs aim at the truth, desires aim at their satisfaction, something like that, I don't like to talk that way. I don't understand people when they talk that way, because it seems to me there's sort of essential reliance on the metaphor. I don't know when you stop saying, so you say beliefs, concepts aim at being useful, something like that, or aim at helping the organism survive. If I say, okay, but you're not really saying that a concept is a little thing that can form a plan and execute it, and you say, no, of course not, and then I say, well, tell me the story without the metaphor.
I think it has a function.
I'm sorry?
I just think it has a function. Not that I haven't accounted for that.
So I think it has lots of effects, and some of those, it's useful for us to notice and useful for us to have something that has them, but I don't think there's any principal distinction between functional effects and other kinds. Lisa?
Thanks, Louise. I think this is super interesting. I'm wondering about the role that sort of suitable interpretation is playing in
Yeah.
theory, right? Because this is bringing in this interpretivist aspect to
Yes.
it. And so,
I'm embracing it, I'm doubling down on it.
okay, so first is a question about like why. So let me offer sort of my best understanding of why you might be okay with this, and maybe you can tell me. So it looks like it's going to be quarantined in the sense that the account of why concepts get their content is not at all dependent on the fact that this was irrational.
That's
You
right,
still have the same old theory of content,
that's right.
and so we're not worried that this sort of interpretivist element is going to disrupt our.
That's exactly right, that's what I have in mind, yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad that's what you're saying. The second question is that I wanted you to maybe say a little bit more about what constraints there are on this intelligible interpretation, right? Because we could come out having many kinds of processes come out as weakly rational in this sense, and I don't know whether you see that as a difficulty or a benefit of the view, or whether you want to think of it as fairly constrained.
So thanks. Okay, so there are a couple of things that pin things down. The end state is a genuine concept, and it has to fit whatever conditions are necessary, naturalistic conditions are necessary and sufficient for something, some mental item having a certain content. So that pins it down a little bit. So not all processes that could be construed as an input-output computation are going to be genuinely intelligible causal because their output doesn't have the right character. And then the other thing that pins them down is that the input really has to be, when you interpret it, the interpretation is constrained to make use of the coding that encodes the information.
So I guess I'm worried more actually about the transition. So let's think about the non-logical case. So the case where we're not going from an experience of a bump to the concept of a bump, but something where it's better construed as a kind of abductive inference or a kind of concept formation where there isn't sort of this one-to-one connection. It seems like there are going to be lots of, more abstract concepts or more general concepts where there isn't going to be sort of one information, one experience that maps on to whose content maps on to the content of the concept. It seems like, what constraints do we have for saying when such a process is weakly rational or not?
Well, okay, so maybe you need repeated exposure to instances of the concept before the concept gets generated. Lila's going to help me.
No, on exposure alone, I think this is the point at which I'm completely bewildered.
Uh-oh.
Because how do you know which experience?
So
you have a bunch of experiences. If you're going to form this first stereotype on your way to getting a concept, then you have to get the very meaning of a stereotype that sort of insists that there are going to be several experiences. And you're going to know enough to put them, some set of them, in the same bin. So as
yes, what gathers them up?
How did you decide which experiences to put
Put
in
together.
the same
Yeah.
thing.
Okay.
So, isn't this is the story we tell over and over and over again? I mean, this is the question I think we raised over and over again. If you didn't know it in advance, how to
Okay.
organize these things, you couldn't even form the stereotype, no less get from the stereotype to the concept. So it must have been that originally, by the hand of nature, the pins were labeled.
Okay.
That's a,
Okay, so that's what Eric was pushing, and
That's
that
what-
would be,
what?
Eric Margolis was pushing that, and if that's the case, I think Descartes believes some. Does anybody know anything about Descartes? I'll go ahead. I think Descartes thought that, he thought that ideas of color were innate, and he didn't mean that you see flashes of red all the time. It meant that your head is constructed in such a way that when you encounter something red, you just get the concept red. So I'm agreeing with Jerry, provisionally anyway, that there is this process of triggering, that certain kinds of experiences evoke or eventuate in the generation of a mental representation. And then this locking, right, is completely mysterious. Jerry tells us no more than that's the job for neurology. It has to do the locking. And what I'm trying to do is get a little more articulation of that. To connect what I think you're pressing me on with what Lisa is saying, when we know stuff about, and by saying we know stuff about vision, what I mean is I know which books to go look at if I want to find out more about this. But what we know about vision can give us a very detailed psychophysical account of how a set of stimuli in the environment are going to produce a certain pattern on our retina. Now, it may be that you have to experience many such retinal patterns, and it might be that somehow or other the neurology, maybe through being a neural net or something, is extracting similarities from those disparate experiences. That might be what's required, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a hard objective fact that a certain amount of information, certain information is being carried. When we want to attribute this informational content to the perceptual experience, we are disciplined by an understanding of how the encoding works. And one of the kinds of slippage I think there is that before we know anything about visual processing, we can still characterize the informational content. The informational content of a perceptual experience of horse is horse or thing that looks like a horse. It's massively disjunctive. It has to be massively disjunctive if it's going to be genuinely information theoretic. And that's fine. So you can characterize the informational content in terms of the disjunction of all possible causes of it. Or you can look more proximally and see what the pattern of radiation of the retina is compatible with. And that's also going to be massively disjunctive. I know I didn't answer your question, but I'm going to Sure.
I thought Jerry's view was that you were something like a version of Eric's, that you were born with stereotypes, at least for basic concepts. You have a whole end section at the end of concepts.
Well, he seems to object to Eric analogy too.
Well, but let me just finish, because I thought that he also goes on. I'm not crazy about this move he makes, but it was an interesting move to say, look, here's what you do. You realize that doorknobs are. Why there's a rational connection? Because doorknobs are the sort of things that, when you're given certain stereotypical instances, that you'll walk on the doorknob. That's just what they are.
Yeah.
But you're born with the stereotypes. And I thought
That's compatible with everything that I said. I just wanted,
so you're born with the templates.
maybe you are, maybe you're not. It's not essential to my story that you're born with the templates, but it's perfectly okay by my lines if you are.
I see. Okay, I thought that was Jerry's view, though, and it seemed an interesting view too.
Well, we have to look at what he says about Eric's view, because Eric's view seems fine to me.
It's not.
Sorry?
It's not.
It's not.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Yes, let's know.
What
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you were ahead of me, right? Because I couldn't see behind me like Gibson says, I'm sure.
So an important component, is modes of presentation, MOPs,
Yeah.
which, is meant to explain why you present a prototype of a concept, but the child doesn't only acquire the prototype, it acquires, to have the prototype verb, it acquires verb. And Mozart, he never was so specific about Mozart presentation, but he was specific that that's an important component, the way things are presented in order to activate the concept. You don't present the bonsai,
Well, I'm very skeptical that he would want to say that mode of presentation was an aspect of meaning. He was a pretty serious referentialist. You have the mental representations, you have the property they represent. Mode of presentation, that's not part of the semantics. That might be part of what secures the nonologically proper relationship. So horse in big letters means horses, just in case. The horse-caused horse tokens, the law that entails that horses cause horse tokens is asymmetrically dependent on the laws that cause non-horses to sometimes cause horse tokens. But mode of presentation plays no role in semantics.
What do you think the role is of Mozart presentation?
I don't actually believe in them. I think there are things that help secure those connections, but those aren't part of the meaning. That's just part of the etiology of the connection.
It's part of the process of acquiring concepts.
If you say so.
According to Fodor, you made this.
Oh, okay. I didn't think that was Jerry's view, but he might know better. I thought he thought all sorts of things could play a causal role in establishing or sustaining a connection, but those things weren't part of the meaning.
No, they're not part of the meaning, but they are part of the process of acquiring concepts.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, but I heard you say, well, if you have experience, then maybe. Yesterday I presented a case of where people get inundated with experience and don't form a concept.
Uh-huh.
So we have to keep that in mind.
Oh, well, there might be concepts that can't be acquired empirically. And I'm sure number is one of them.
No, people learn it. If you have mathematics.
But I'm sure that it's okay.
So it's a different kind.
It just, yeah.
And as opposed to what I think is a good example of what you might want to use is a rowboat, which affords stepping into or pouring water into.
Yeah, I don't really believe in affordances either. I mean, I understand that some of us can see certain kinds of things and know what they're for, but I don't think it's inherent in the construction of the rowboat that you understand that it's
Well,
putting
standing on a
water.
tree if you're a bird.
Well, okay, let's suppose there are affordances. Everything's better or worse. How does this affect me?
I don't know that. I mean, it leads me to.
I mean, I don't see that I don't really understand what an affordance is other than some kind of recognition on the part of the subject that something in the environment can be used or interact in a certain way. I mean, I think there are a whole bunch of ways you could come to such a conclusion about something. I don't know, why. I mean, I could see that it's a good thing for hiding under if I need a place to hide. I don't know if that's an affordance of the rowboat or just something that I figured out. And I don't know why we would need to make that distinction.
There's one place where the notion of template, I think, is used with evidence, and that's a bird song,
Okay.
right? Is that what you mean by a template? That is the environment that will tune the template.
I'm not committed to any serious articulation of the notion of a template. I need to be informed by people that actually have theories of these things. I was suggesting my very simple idea, which is certainly not the case, is that there's actually a set of paper stencils that some little person puts up and compares with experience.
So I would like to try out something that is an alternative to the template idea and see how that connects up with your weekly Intelligible. So when you go to New Zealand, when the first human being arrived in New Zealand, saw a platypus, right? Okay, so I've never seen something look like that before. On Jerry's story, you've been carrying all this time a platypus template, right? And I think a lot of us have problems with that. But I have much less problem with the following account, in which we have a scheme for encoding shapes, and
Uh-huh.
it's generative.
Uh-huh.
That is, there's a set of, say, 50 parameters, and you adjust the parameters of this shape producing, and it will produce, like Adobe Illustrator, it'll generate a shape for you. And so when you see the platypus, you encode the shape of the platypus with,
Using this.
that's what you carry away from your first encounter with a platypus. And it enables you to recognize platypuses subsequently, right? So the problem with repetition is that in order to recognize that something is the same thing that you saw before, you have to encode it the first time in a way that matches the code the second time, or the second time is always the first time,
Right.
So there has to be something like this. Right?
Yeah.
Now this seems to me like your weakly intelligible.
It could be.
That is the code. This has the property that someone who knew the code would sit there and read off the parameters and say, they saw something that looked like this, right?
Right. And maybe it's a classical computation and it involves actually representing these elements of the shape.
Oh, I assume it is.
But it might not be. It might be some. So Chaz Firestone and Brian Scholl have argued that you can construct these things they call shape skeletons. People have heard about this. And the way you generate them is you just get lots of subjects and you just tell them to tap a picture of a horse or dog or whatever. And it turns out that when you put all the taps together, you get these things that are sort of like skeletons, but they're not, because they're geometric representations that differentiate, for example, Pomeranian dog from a Persian cat, even though they look a lot alike. So that might be an intelligible causal process. There might just be some kind of neural net extraction of irregularity. And maybe it can be done in one trial learning. I don't know. Yay, good. I'm perfectly willing, though, to hostage myself to the facts.
Yeah, those show tapping things look almost identical to what a computational vision person calls a medial axis representation.
So that's a
computed in
question.
a way that Feldman, among others, have been describing.
Yeah.
And they capture like stick drawings.
Right.
That is, you look and you say, that's a deer, even though it's just a few wiggly lines, or that's a buffalo, right?
Right.
So that's the kind of thing I was thinking of when I said you have this generative scheme for encoding shape.
Yeah, so it could be a generative scheme, or it could be a stock of shape skeleton templates.
Well,
as far as I'm concerned,
that's the Biederman theory of how to represent
as
shape.
far as I'm concerned, either one, and I'm prepared to do what the people who study this stuff tell me I should do.
One more short question and short response.
I don't like that theory.
All right, we'll try.
I was just wondering whether you think there is a deep individual question.
I'm sorry. I can't, can you talk louder?
I'm wondering whether you think, for your view, maybe especially for this bonus issue at the end about the interface problem, you think there's a deep and difficult question about what the right coding scheme is? My thought being that information is very easy to come by, and just to illustrate with your tree example, the number 1000 on the clicker might carry information about the species of the tree and have the right coding scheme.
Totally. And I think that there might be, what's really necessary for this thing to work is that there be some kind of fit between the formatting of the encoding of the information and the computational process that's going to operate on it. So think about looking at an oscilloscope readout of the Beethoven sonata. I think probably with enough practice, you might learn to recognize visual patterns that could actually produce auditory imagery. And we know from sensory substitution in cases of blind people that echolocate and so forth, there's information in the stuff that we do in the environment that makes noise. There's information, but most of us we either don't have it or we haven't built it yet, a computational mechanism that's sensitive to the physical parameters that encode that information. But radar, all of the technologies that we've developed to take advantage of forms of information carrying that we can't with our naked eyes at work, that's fine. I mean, I'm perfectly happy for there to be tons of information in the signal with different modes of encoding. And the question is just, what are the computational mechanisms doing? Can they take advantage of encoding?
Let's thank Louise.
Thank you.